Welcome, dear viewers, to a journey into one of the most thought-provoking chapters of ancient history, the trial of Socrates. In this captivating video series, we'll travel back to the golden age of Athens, a time of unparalleled intellectual brilliance, political transformation, and philosophical awakening, but also a time of deep tension and profound questions. Socrates, the father of Western philosophy, was a man who dared to question everything, from gods and government to ethics and education. His methods, known as the Socratic dialogues, inspired generations to seek truth through reasoned debate. But in 350 BCE, his unwavering commitment to critical inquiry put him on trial for impiety and corrupting the youth. This series explores not only the courtroom drama that unfolded, but also the cultural, political, and personal forces that led to the death of one of history's greatest minds. You'll meet fellow philosophers, powerful politicians, and ordinary citizens caught in the wake of one man's relentless pursuit of truth. So grab a cup of tea, settle into a thoughtful mindset, and prepare to witness a tale of wisdom, courage, and tragic consolation. The trial begins now. Let's discover what truly happened to Socrates in the bustling heart of 4th century Athens. A peculiar figure wandered the agora, the city's grand marketplace. Bald, barefoot, and dressed in simple robes, Socrates was no ordinary Athenian. With piercing eyes and a sharp tongue, he spent his days questioning craftsmen, politicians, poets, and anyone bold enough to engage. He asked not for coin or applause, but for truth. Socrates believed that wisdom began with admitting ignorance. "I know that I know nothing," he'd often proclaim, a paradox that puzzled many. He didn't write books or open a school. Instead, he taught through dialogue, drawing out contradictions in his interlocutors' beliefs until they were left with no ground to stand on, or a deeper understanding than before. His presence was both admired and resented. To some, he was a gadfly, a necessary irritant that kept Athens thinking. To others, he was a dangerous influence, challenging traditional values and questioning the gods themselves. As Athens reeled from its recent defeat in the Peloponnesian War and faced unrest at home, scapegoats were in demand. Socrates' fame grew, but so did his enemies. Rumors began to spread. He corrupts the youth. He disrespects the gods. He undermines the city's morals. The quiet murmurs were only the beginning. A storm was coming, and Socrates stood at its center, calm, firm, and unflinching. The scars of war ran deep in the marble streets of Athens. Only a few years earlier, the mighty city had fallen to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, a devastating conflict that drained resources, morale, and unity. Once the cradle of democracy and culture, Athens now staggered under the weight of defeat, betrayal, and political upheaval. After the war, a brutal regime known as the 30 Tyrants seized control. Backed by Sparta, they ruled with iron fists, exiling, executing, and silencing dissent. Even Socrates, despite his apolitical stance, was not untouched. Some of his former students were among the tyrants, and whispers began to tie him to their crimes. But democracy, though bruised, returned. The tyrants fell, and a fragile sense of order was restored. Yet suspicion lingered. Citizens wanted accountability. They sought to rebuild not only their city, but also their values. In this new Athens, the memory of war clashed with the desire for moral clarity. Socrates, still roaming the streets and questioning the very foundations of knowledge and piety, now stood out more than ever. His refusal to flatter, his indifference to wealth, and his open criticism of traditional authority stirred unease. In the eyes of many, Socrates represented the old wounds that had yet to heal, and perhaps a dangerous reminder of past chaos. The name 30 Tyrants was still spoken with clenched jaws in the streets of Athens. Appointed after the city's surrender, they had promised order, but delivered terror. In their brief rule over Wubacked Athenians were executed without trial. Homes were seized, voices were silenced, and though their reign ended, the memory remained. Critias, the ruthless architect of the regime, was once a student of Socrates. This connection, though indirect, began to taint the philosopher's image. How could the teacher of such a despot be blameless? Rumors brewed in the wine shops and council chambers. Was Socrates sowing rebellion behind a veil of wisdom? In the restored democracy, such associations became dangerous. Athens now sought unity, and Socrates' refusal to renounce his former pupils or adjust his method of inquiry felt, to many, like a but Socrates was unmoved. He had never claimed to control his students, only to provoke thought. To him, ideas were weapons of peace, not war. Nonetheless, the city's wounds had not yet healed, and its leaders were wary of any voice that challenged the fragile harmony. Kokeri, in that tense climate, the seeds of a trial were quietly sown, not in a courtroom, but in the hearts of suspicious citizens seeking justice in all the wrong places. Among those who watched Socrates with growing suspicion was Anytus, a prominent politician and passionate defender of democracy. He had helped restore Athens after the fall of the 30 tyrants and was revered for his civic commitment. But Anytus held a personal grudge against the philosopher that ran deeper than politics. Socrates had publicly criticized the craftsmen and politicians of Athens, including the fathers of well-known families. One such man was Anytus's own son, who had fallen under Socrates' influence. The boy had begun to question authority, mock sacred traditions, and drift away from his father's expectations. Anytus blamed Socrates. To Anytus, Socrates was more than a nuisance. He was a corrupter, a threat to the moral foundation of Athens. He believed that the city's survival rested on loyalty to its gods and laws. Anyone who undermined that unity, even under the banner of philosophy, must be stopped. In public speeches and private gatherings, Anytus began to stir the pot. He spoke of corruption, of disloyalty, of dangerous teachers who led the youth astray. And slowly, the idea took root. Perhaps Socrates was not just a harmless old thinker after all. The whispers turned into plans. Anytus would soon become one of the principal accusers in a case that would shake the soul of Athens and worse. One morning, a curious notice was posted in the heart of Athens, a wooden tablet etched with a formal accusation. It named Socrates as the defendant. The charges were grave: impiety, failing to recognize the gods of the city, and corruption of the youth. The man who officially filed the accusation was Meletus, a young and relatively obscure poet. But few doubted that Anytus and a third man, Lycon, a rhetorician, were the real force behind it. Together, they represented the offended pillars of Athenian life: religion, politics, and education. The city buzzed with shock and curiosity. Some cheered, others whispered in disbelief. Socrates, however, remained calm. He welcomed the trial. In his mind, this was a chance, not just to defend himself, but to challenge the very way Athens defined virtue and truth. The case would be heard by a jury of Ubat citizens. They would not only weigh the legal charges, but also the deeper question: can a man be condemned for encouraging people to think? Friends urged Socrates to flee, but he refused. He had always obeyed the laws of the city, and he would continue to do so, even if those laws condemned him. Thus, with one quiet inscription, the stage was set for the most famous trial in philosophical history. The trial of Socrates was not simply the effort of one man. It was the coordinated action of three: Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon. Each represented a different voice of Athenian society, and together they formed a united front determined to bring the philosopher to justice. Meletus, the poet, was the face of the accusation. He claimed Socrates denied the gods of the city and introduced strange divinities. With youthful arrogance and religious fervor, he portrayed himself as a protector of tradition. But many suspected he was a mere figurehead. Anytus, the statesman, held real power, respected and feared. He framed Socrates as a political threat, an intellectual who undermined democracy by encouraging young men to challenge authority. His hatred was personal, and he saw Socrates as the symbol of a dangerous elite. Lycon, a skilled orator, joined the charge on behalf of the educators and rhetoricians. Socrates had long mocked sophistry, claiming that true wisdom could not be bought or sold. Lycon took this as a direct insult to his profession. He wanted revenge. Together they submitted their charges to the archon, the magistrate, who deemed the case strong enough to proceed. A date was set. Athens braced for a philosophical confrontation unlike any other, and Socrates? He prepared not with weapons or tricks, but with thought, conviction, and a deep belief that truth, if spoken clearly, would defend itself. Among Socrates' devoted followers, none was more earnest or more alarmed than the young philosopher Plato. Tall, intelligent, and idealistic, Plato saw his teacher not merely as a thinker, but as a moral compass for all of Athens. The news of the charges struck him like thunder. Plato had seen the city fall and rise, had endured tyranny and its collapse, and through it all, Socrates had remained a steady voice of reason. Now, Plato watched the same city prepare to silence that voice in the name of stability. Desperate to help, Plato urged Socrates to flee the city. "You owe it to your wisdom," he argued, "to preserve it for future generations." Others, Crito, Apollodorus, and Xenophon, echoed the plea, but Socrates refused. He believed in the rule of law, even flawed law. To escape would be to undermine everything he had taught. One must never do wrong, even in response to wrongdoing, he told them. Plato was torn, admiring his master's integrity but fearing the loss of a soul who had reshaped the world of thought. He began writing feverishly, determined to preserve Socrates' ideas before it was too late. For Plato, the trial wasn't just about Socrates. It was a crossroads for philosophy, democracy, and justice itself. In Athens, trials were not decided by judges, but by the voice of the people. For the case of Socrates, Wubact citizens were drawn by lot to serve as jurors, men over the age of censors, selected from across the city's 10 tribes. Their verdict would determine the philosopher's fate. As dawn broke on the appointed day, the chosen men assembled at the Heliaia, the great people's court. The space buzzed with tension. Some jurors knew of Socrates only by reputation. Others had debated him in the agora, often to their own frustration. Court officials distributed tokens to jurors, bronze discs used to vote at the trial's end. Already, whispers spread about how Socrates might defend himself. Would he humble himself before the court? Would he beg for mercy? Outside the court, the streets of Athens were thick with speculation. Vendors sold olives and figs beside men who argued over guilt or innocence. Youths climbed columns for a better view. Philosophers discussed fate inside Socrates arrived with quiet dignity. He brought no lawyer. In Athens, it was custom for the accused to speak for themselves, and Socrates, the master of reasoned dialogue, would not entrust his defense to anyone else. The jury took their seats. The court was silent. The trial of Socrates was about to begin. The trial opened with the voice of Meletus, the youthful accuser who had brought the formal charges. Standing tall and serious before the court, he began his case with calm certainty. He accused Socrates of not believing in the gods of the state, an impiety that struck at the heart of Athenian identity. This man, Meletus declared, teaches strange spirits and divinities not recognized by our temples. He mocks sacred traditions. He turns the minds of youth away from reverence. The courtroom murmured. Meletus continued, claiming that Socrates' method of questioning, his relentless interrogation of poets, craftsmen, and public officials, had undermined faith in civic virtue. He has made the young believe that wisdom is arrogance, that tradition is superstition, and that democracy is ignorance. To many jurors, this argument rang familiar. They had heard their own sons echo Socratic doubts. Was it innocent curiosity? Socrates listened without interruption, his eyes fixed on Meletus, not with anger, but with the curiosity of a teacher hearing a flawed thesis. When Meletus concluded, the court was hushed. His accusations had been clear, formal, and emotionally charged. Yet something lingered in the air. Was this the voice of justice, or of fear disguised as piety? Socrates stood to speak next, but not before the jurors absorbed every word of their first witness. As Meletus stepped back into the crowd, Socrates rose, slowly, deliberately. He walked to the center of the court with no scrolls, no advocate, and no dramatic gestures. He had no intention of flattering the jury or begging for mercy. He would defend himself as he had lived, with reason. He opened by addressing the jurors not as an enemy, but as fellow citizens. He admitted that his reputation had long been misunderstood. Falconing, "I am wise," he said, "only in that I know nothing." He then recounted the tale of the Delphic oracle, who had once declared that no man was wiser than Socrates. Perplexed, he had set out to test this. By questioning politicians, poets, and craftsmen, he discovered that while they believed themselves wise, their knowledge was often hollow. His role, therefore, had been a divine mission, to expose false wisdom and awaken true understanding. Socrates denied corrupting the youth. "Ask any of them," he challenged. "Have I ever taught for pay? Have I told them what to think?" His teachings, he insisted, were dialogues, exercises in self-discovery, not indoctrination. He even questioned Meletus directly, leading him into a verbal trap that exposed contradictions in the accusations. The jury stirred. Some smiled, others frowned. Socrates' voice remained steady. He did not seek to charm, but to clarify. This was no ordinary defense. It was a lesson. The philosopher was on trial, but so too was truth. Socrates, ever the master of dialectic, turned his defense into an opportunity for cross-examination. Fixing his gaze on Meletus, he invited the accuser to clarify his charges, publicly, logically, and without evasion. "Do I corrupt the youth deliberately or unintentionally?" he asked. Meletus responded, "Deliberately." Socrates then pounced. "If I corrupt them deliberately, I must wish harm upon myself, since corrupt citizens would harm me in return. And if I do so unintentionally, I should be corrected, not punished." "Which is it, Meletus?" The courtroom buzzed. Jurors whispered. Even some of Meletus's allies shifted uncomfortably. Socrates continued, "Do I not believe in gods, as you claim? Or do I teach of spiritual beings?" Meletus tried to argue both, But Socrates gently pointed out the contradiction. Belief in spiritual things implies belief in spirits, and spirits must come from gods. Gikabresis taikoprish. One by one, the accusations unraveled, not through anger or defense, but through simple questions. Socrates' method, the relentless, revealed not only flaws in Meletus' claims, but also the fragility of assumptions, the same fragility he had challenged in poets, generals, and politicians. Yet his skill at debate was both his shield and his sword. For while it impressed some, it humiliated others. And in a courtroom of prideful citizens, humiliation could be dangerous. Socrates shifted his argument to the heart of Meletus's charges: impiety. He addressed the jury not with defiance, but with a clear and challenging question: what does it mean to be pious? He explained that belief in the divine was not bound by ritual or myth, but by the pursuit of wisdom and virtue. I do believe in the gods, he said, though not in the way poets and playwrights portray them, with their jealousies, lies, and violence. My reverence is toward the divine order, toward reason and justice. The jurors stirred. Athens had long honored its gods with temples, sacrifices, and festivals. To question those stories was to question identity itself. Yet Socrates pushed, must we not test our beliefs, he asked, to ensure they are worthy of the gods we claim to serve? He turned again to Meletus. Do you think I teach atheism when I speak of a divine voice within me, a daemonion that restrains me from wrongdoing? The court fell silent. In truth, many Athenians understood Socrates' references to a personal divine sign. It was a form of spiritual conscience, deeply unorthodox, but not easily dismissed. The accusation of impiety was weakening. But in its place rose a subtler fear. Socrates was not godless. He was something far more dangerous, a man who thought for himself. As the trial unfolded, the silent presence of Socrates' students became more visible. They lined the back walls of the court, Plato, Crito, Apollodorus, and others, listening with furrowed brows and clenched fists. They were the so-called corrupted youth, now grown into young men of intellect and purpose. The accusations against Socrates claimed he led them astray. Yet the students themselves were a testament to something else entirely. Thinkers, writers, future statesmen. They had not been corrupted. They had been awakened. Plato could barely stay silent. He whispered among his companions, noting Socrates' every phrase. He wished to speak, to shout to the jury, to remind them that questioning was not corruption. It was citizenship. But the court had not called on students to testify. The accusers relied on fear that their own sons would grow distant, that tradition would be undone, that reason would unseat obedience. One by one, these young men exchanged glances. They knew what Socrates meant when he spoke of living a life examined. His teachings had not been about rebellion, but about truth. Outside the courtroom, the youth discussed what would happen if Athens silenced its greatest teacher. What would be left? Inside, Socrates glanced at them briefly. A faint smile crossed his face. He saw not disciples, but successors standing before the jury. Socrates reminded them of a paradox that had defined his life. True wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. He recounted how, after the oracle of Delphi proclaimed him the wisest man in Athens, he had set out to find someone wiser. He visited politicians, poets, and artisans. All believed themselves wise, but when questioned, their confidence crumbled. They knew facts, but lacked understanding. They clung to reputation, not reason. I am wiser, Socrates explained, only because I do not pretend to know what I do not know. No, do not know. It was a radical notion in a city built on certainty. certainty of gods, laws, honor, and heritage. But Socrates challenged the foundation of that certainty, not to destroy it, but to examine it. Some jurors nodded slowly, perhaps remembering encounters with Socrates in the agora. Others bristled, insulted by the suggestion that their wisdom was shallow. Socrates' humility was not weakness. It was strength. It invited dialogue instead of declaration. It replaced dogma with discovery. But Athens, still aching from war and tyranny, craved simplicity. Socrates offered only questions, and for some, that was the most dangerous gift of all. Socrates compared himself to a gadfly, a small, persistent insect that stings the lazy horse into motion. Athens, he declared, is like a noble steed grown sluggish from its greatness, and I am the gadfly sent by the gods to awaken it. The metaphor caused a stir. Some laughed, others frowned, but the meaning was clear. Socrates believed his mission was not to comfort Athens, but to provoke it, to challenge assumptions, stir thought, and prevent stagnation. He told the jurors that far from harming the city, his questions were an act of love. If you kill me, he warned, you will not easily find another like me, one who urges you to examine virtue, justice, and your own souls. It was a plea not for pity, but for awareness. Socrates offered no apologies. He admitted no guilt. He simply stood before the court as he always had before his students, with honesty, stubbornness, and purpose. But not all Athenians saw the gadfly as a gift. To many, he was an irritant, a man who respected no office, no tradition, no sacred line. His voice, once dismissed as harmless, now felt like a challenge to the very order they had restored. The trial, it seemed, was no longer about impiety or corruption. It was about whether Athens would tolerate discomfort in pursuit of truth outside the walls of the courtroom. Athens trembled with debate. Word of Socrates' trial had spread through the city like wildfire. In every portico, workshop, and market stall, citizens argued, was the philosopher a threat to democracy or its very conscience? Older citizens recalled the instability of recent years. The rise and fall of the 30 tyrants had left deep wounds. To them, Socrates' defiance and influence over the youth evoked memories of arrogance and collapse. But younger voices, many of whom had sat at Socrates' feet, defended him. He teaches us to think, they said, not to obey blindly. For them, philosophy was not rebellion but reformation, a path to a better, wiser Athens. Tension echoed through the streets. Priests worried about the erosion of piety. Veterans longed for order. Mothers feared the influence on their sons. And hidden in the background, political figures like Anytus stoked those anxieties, whispering that Athens must choose stability over chaos. The trial had become a mirror, reflecting not only Socrates' fate, but the identity of the city itself. Inside the court, Socrates remained still, but he knew the forces at play were larger than logic. They were fear, memory, pride, and the fragile hope of a democracy still rebuilding. The question now was not just, is Socrates guilty? But rather, can Athens survive the discomfort of his truth? The speeches had ended. The questioning was done. Now, it was time for the jury to decide. Each of the Wubat jurors was handed a pair of bronze discs, one marked for guilt, the other for acquittal. They approached the urns in silence, casting their vote unseen. There was no deliberation, no debate, only personal judgment shaped by what they had seen, heard, and feared. Outside the court, the crowd was hushed. Inside, tension thickened like smoke. Socrates stood as he had all day, calm, unbowed. He had not pleaded for mercy, nor appealed to emotion. He had offered truth, however inconvenient. The court clerk, after collecting the tokens, began the count. Arbeck Basher's votes, guilty. Arbeck Urser's votes, not guilty, a narrow margin. Just 60 votes between freedom and condemnation. The courtroom stirred. Some looked away. Others met Socrates' gaze and held it, unsure whether to feel regret or relief. Socrates did not flinch. He nodded, as if he had expected the outcome all along. His friends were pale with disbelief. Plato clenched his writing tablet. Crito shook his head in grief. And yet, in that moment, Socrates appeared unafraid, even serene. The trial was not over. Athens now had to decide his punishment. The next phase would determine whether this man, who had asked too many questions, would live or die. Following the guilty verdict, Athenian law required a second vote. The jury must decide the punishment. The accusers, led by Meletus, immediately proposed death, but custom allowed Socrates to submit a counter-proposal. He could suggest an alternative penalty: exile, imprisonment, a fine, or any fate short of death. If persuasive, the jury might accept it. All eyes turned to Socrates. He stood calmly and addressed the court. Not to plead, but to provoke. "What shall I propose?" he asked aloud, almost smiling. "For a lifetime of service to Athens, I ought to be rewarded. Perhaps I should be fed at the Prytaneum, alongside the city's heroes." A few jurors chuckled uneasily. Was it irony? Arrogance? Courage? Then, more soberly, Socrates offered to pay a fine. At first, he named a paltry sum, which angered many. But with encouragement from Plato and friends, he increased the offer to 30 minas, a significant amount, to be paid by his supporters. Still, his refusal to show remorse stirred resentment. He did not beg. He did not admit wrongdoing. To flee death by dishonesty, he said, would be worse than death itself. His friends wept silently. The jury returned to their stations for a second vote. The result: death sentence confirmed. The philosopher would be executed by drinking hemlock. The verdict sent ripples through Athens, like a stone cast into still water. News spread from the courtroom to the agora, then into every home and temple. Socrates was to die, not for theft or murder, but for ideas. To many, the sentence was a relief. Athenian elders, anxious about growing challenges to authority and piety, believed the gadfly had finally been swatted. Some politicians breathed easier, knowing they had silenced a voice that had embarrassed them in public squares. But among the youth, and within the quiet minds of thoughtful citizens, there was confusion and shame. How could the city that gave birth to democracy and reason now execute its own philosopher? In the home of Socrates' followers, grief mixed with fury. Plato was stunned into silence. Apollodorus wept uncontrollably. Crito began making plans. Perhaps Socrates could still escape. Others, struck by guilt, blamed themselves for not speaking up. Socrates, however, remained tranquil. He spent the hours after the sentence in calm conversation with his companions. "No evil can happen to a good man," he said. "Not in life, nor in death." Athens had passed judgment, but within the small circle of students and friends, another truth was blooming. Socrates would die, but his voice would live forever. The execution would not silence him. It would immortalize him. In the dim quiet of Socrates' cell, his friend Crito entered with urgency in his step and a plan in his heart. The death sentence had not yet been carried out. Athens observed a religious delay during the sacred voyage to Delos. Until the ship returned, no executions could take place. There was still time. Crito leaned close and spoke in a whisper. "You must escape. We have friends. We have money. Everything is arranged. We can get you out tonight." Socrates looked at him gently. "Do you believe," he asked, "that it is just for me to escape?" Crito pleaded. "Your sons need you. Your students need you. If you die, your enemies win." But Socrates would not be swayed by fear or affection. He believed in the rule of law, even if flawed. If he chose to live in Athens, he must also choose to accept its judgments. To flee would be to betray his philosophy, his values, and the very lessons he had spent his life teaching. "A man must not do wrong even in response to wrong," he said. "To act unjustly is always evil, no matter the circumstance." Crito fell silent, tears welling in his eyes. He realized this was not just Socrates' end, but his final lesson. In that still prison, amidst cracked stone walls and flickering oil light, justice and loyalty met face to face, and truth stood firm. Days passed in quiet waiting. Athens observed its sacred custom. No executions were to occur while the state ship was on pilgrimage to Delos, honoring Apollo and Theseus's legendary voyage. The city watched the horizon, awaiting the ship's return. In the prison, Socrates spent his final days in deep conversation, surrounded by friends who came and went like silent tides. He welcomed them all, not with despair, but with curiosity and warmth. Philosophy remained his constant companion. He discussed the soul, justice, and the afterlife, exploring what it meant to die a good death. His belief in the immortality of the soul offered him calm. Death, he said, was either a dreamless sleep or a passage to another realm where great thinkers and heroes awaited. On the morning the ship returned, its white sail gleaming in the sun, a hush fell over the city. The sacred period was over. The sentence would be carried out before the day's end. His followers gathered once more. Some cried. Others were stoic. Socrates embraced them each, offering gratitude rather than grief. He had always believed that philosophy was preparation for death, not in despair, but in peace. And now he would meet death not as a victim, but as a philosopher to the end. As the sun climbed slowly over Athens, Socrates sat surrounded by his closest companions, Plato, Crito, Apollodorus, Phaedo, and a few others. The mood was somber but serene. They were not there to mourn but to learn. Socrates, even now, was teaching. The topic turned to death and the soul. Socrates spoke with clarity and conviction. He argued that the soul was eternal, that death was not the end, but a release from the limitations of the body. A true philosopher, he said, practices dying every day, not through sorrow but through the pursuit of truth. He described death as a kind of liberation, freeing the soul to dwell among the forms, pure, perfect realities that could not be touched in life. His friends listened in silence, their grief softened by his steady voice. Apollodorus, ever emotional, wept openly. Socrates comforted him. "We must part with joy, not tears." Plato, recording each word in his mind, would later preserve this day in his famous dialogue, Phaedo. As the jailer entered with the cup of hemlock, the room fell silent, but there was no fear on Socrates' face. Only peace. He took the cup with steady hands. "I owe a rooster to Asclepius," he said. "See that it is paid." A final joke, perhaps, or a final symbol, that death was a kind of healing. He drank. The end was near, but his legacy had just begun. Socrates held the cup in both hands and drank the bitter hemlock without hesitation. The room was utterly silent. No speeches, no pleas, only the soft weeping of those who loved him most. He handed the cup back to the jailer and calmly stood for a moment. "We must wait," he said, "until the poison reaches my heart." A few paces back and forth, then he lay down as instructed on the low stone bench. The poison worked from the feet upward. Socrates remained fully conscious, describing the numbness as it climbed his legs. His friends sat at his side, clinging to every moment, as if their stillness might stop the inevitable. Apollodorus sobbed openly now, unable to contain himself. Plato looked away, his eyes wet, but his jaw set in silent awe. Crito held Socrates' hand as the philosopher spoke his final words. "Crito," Socrates whispered, "we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay the debt." And then, slowly, his breathing faded. The stillness deepened. His chest no longer rose. His soul, by his own teachings, had departed into a greater realm. For the friends who remained, grief fell like a shadow, but also a strange kind of peace. Socrates had lived as he taught, and died without fear. Athens had executed its philosopher. But his ideas would spread far beyond the prison walls, into scrolls, schools, and centuries. After Socrates drew his final breath, a profound silence filled the cell. His companions remained still, as though afraid that movement would sever the last fragile thread connecting them to their teacher. No cries, no arguments, only quiet and the occasional soft weep of Apollodorus. Plato sat apart, head bowed, deep in thought. He did not witness the final moment. He would later write that he was ill that day. But in truth, perhaps even Plato could not bear to see the light of his mentor extinguished. Crito closed Socrates' eyes with trembling hands. The clay cup lay tipped on the floor, a smear of bitter hemlock drying on the stone. The jailer, unexpectedly respectful, allowed the friends to stay. "Take your time," he said. Even he, a functionary of the law, had been moved by the philosopher's composure. The men wrapped Socrates' body in cloth. There would be no grand procession, no public mourning. Athenian law forbade it for condemned men. But in quiet hearts, grief took root. Outside the prison, the city carried on. Markets opened, horses trotted past, debates resumed. But something had changed. A light had gone out, and yet, even in silence, Socrates spoke. Through memory, through questions, through the burning desire to understand. His students would carry his voice far beyond Athens, into the academy, into the world, and into history itself. This was not the end. It was the beginning of philosophy's long echo. In the days following Socrates' death, Plato withdrew from public life. He wandered the hills above Athens, sat alone by the Ilissos River, and filled scroll after scroll with memories, reflections, and dialogues that replayed in his mind like echoes. He could not let Socrates' voice fade into silence. Plato understood that the trial had not merely condemned a man, it had exposed a wound in the soul of democracy. A city that had prized wisdom had chosen fear. A place that had birthed reason had turned against its most reasonable citizen. Determined not to let that be the final word, Plato began writing. He composed dialogues, dramatic accounts of Socrates' conversations, where his mentor's voice lived on, sharp and probing, warm and ironic. Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, Phaedo, each became a stone in the foundation of Western philosophy. Through writing, Plato preserved not only ideas, but integrity, a model of living through principle, not popularity. In time, he would found the Academy, a school dedicated to truth-seeking, through reason, not rhetoric. Socrates had taught by questioning. Plato would teach by systematizing. He did not seek revenge. He sought clarity. The death of Socrates had shattered something, but from its fragments, Plato would build a philosophical legacy that would outlive tyrants, cities, and centuries. The mission was clear. Socrates must never be forgotten. Years passed. The pain of Socrates' death remained, but so too did his teachings, burning steadily in the heart of Plato. On the outskirts of Athens, near a sacred grove dedicated to the hero Academos, Plato founded a school unlike any other. There were no formal lectures, no rote memorization. Instead, there were dialogues, arguments, and the careful unraveling of thought. It was called the Academy, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. Here, students gathered to learn how to think, not what to think. They studied mathematics, astronomy, ethics, and above all, philosophy. Plato used Socrates as the central character in his written dialogues, ensuring that his teacher's method and spirit endured. The Academy was not just a school. It was a sanctuary for truth built from the ruins of injustice. While Athens marched on with festivals and politics, the minds within the Academy searched for something higher, something eternal. Visitors came from across the Hellenic world, drawn by the promise of deep understanding. One day, a brilliant young man named Aristotle would walk its paths, guided by Plato, and later build his own system of thought. Socrates had died as a criminal, but within the shaded walks of the Academy, his questions had become seeds, growing into a legacy that would shape civilization. And at its heart stood Plato, still writing, still seeking, still listening to the voice of his master echoing from the past. Plato continued to write long after the founding of the Academy, crafting dialogues that brought Socrates back to life on the page. In Apology, he preserved the trial. In Crito, the arguments for justice. In Phaedo, the serenity of death. And in many others, the voice of reason echoed through questions that still resonate. Lacaneft strays prisons prese to citations queres. Unlike the writings of politicians or generals, Plato's dialogues were not declarations. They were invitations to doubt, to explore, to re-examine even the most cherished beliefs. Through this method, the Socratic dialogue became a revolutionary tool. It wasn't just teaching. It was a practice of freedom. It taught the reader to think critically, to ask why, and to pursue virtue not as dogma, but as a way of life. The dialogues spread across the Greek world and beyond. They were copied, discussed, debated. Centuries later, Roman philosophers would be guided by them. Medieval scholars would preserve them. Renaissance thinkers would revive them, and modern democracies would quote them. In a city that once condemned a philosopher for asking too many questions, those questions had become immortal. Socrates, who had never written a word, now spoke through Plato's pen with eternal clarity. The trial had ended his life, but in that ending, he became a symbol of truth over fear, of ideas over authority, of speech over silence. And wherever people ask questions in search of truth, Socrates speaks still. Years after Socrates' death, Athens began to regret what it had done. The city that had once boasted the world's greatest thinkers, artists, and orators now lived with a quiet stain. As the Academy flourished and Plato's writings gained renown, many Athenians realized they had silenced not a subversive, but a sage. A new generation began to ask, what had truly been corrupted, our youth or our courage to hear the truth? In time, statues of Socrates appeared, not ordered by the state, but commissioned by citizens. They stood in gardens, private courtyards, and academies, not as monuments of pride, but of atonement. Even politicians, once quick to silence dissent, began to quote his words. His questions seeped into law, education, and public life. His influence, once condemned, now became the very spirit of reasoned debate. Some accounts tell of public apologies, of votes to posthumously honor him. The same city that had condemned him now whispered his name with reverence, but the damage had been done. Socrates could not be brought back, What remained was his voice, echoing through dialogue, memory, and marble. Athens had learned a hard lesson. Truth cannot be buried, and wisdom, once awakened, cannot be silenced. And so, amid the Acropolis and temples, a new kind of reverence grew, not just for the gods, but for the man who had dared to ask why. Though Socrates had died by decree, his ideas lived on with greater power than ever before. His death had turned him into more than a philosopher. It had made him a martyr of the mind. Where once his questions had irritated politicians and elders, now they inspired generations. His story became a lesson, not just in Athens, but across civilizations, that free thought is essential to a just society, and that truth is not always welcome in the courts of power. In the academy, students invoked his name with awe. Plato's writings spread from city to city, and in time they would cross oceans, translated into new languages, reborn in different cultures. Socrates became the soul of philosophy, the conscience of Western civilization. Artists painted him, dramatists wrote of him, and rulers studied him, some to understand justice, others to guard against the fear of it. What Socrates had taught was not a doctrine, but a method, a way of thinking critically, living justly, and dying with dignity. His hemlock had not ended his voice. It had preserved it. The poison that stilled his body had stirred the world. And long after the last juror passed, the last accuser was forgotten, Socrates endured, not in monuments of stone, but in the questions still asked today. Brilliant. What is virtue? What is justice? What does it mean to live well? In these questions he breathes. Centuries have passed since Socrates walked the dusty paths of Athens, yet his presence lingers in libraries, in classrooms, in courts of law, and in the quiet moments when one pauses to ask, what is the right thing to do? Socrates left behind no writings. His legacy survives not in parchment, but in questions that demand courage, questions that unsettle, provoke, and awaken the mind, questions that remind us to live without examining one's life is to live in shadow. He was condemned for speaking truth without compromise. Yet his punishment became his power. His death, meant to silence him, instead turned his life into a beacon, a reminder that integrity can outlast injustice. In modern democracies, where speech is both cherished and contested, Socrates remains relevant. In science, ethics, law, and education, his influence shapes how we question authority, fight error. Shapes how we question authority, how we test knowledge, how we seek meaning. And every time a teacher asks a student, "Why do you believe that?" Socrates lives again. His legacy is not in temples or tombs, but in the restless search for wisdom. He taught that wisdom begins with humility, that asking is braver than knowing, that truth is not a possession, but a pursuit. And so, as long as humans wonder, reflect, and strive to live with honesty and thought, the trial of Socrates will never truly end, because the questions he gave us are eternal. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey through the trial of Socrates, a story that transcends time, politics, and even death itself. We've witnessed not just the fall of a man, but the rise of an idea, that the pursuit of truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is one of the highest callings of a human life. Socrates challenged his city, his students, and his accusers, not with anger or ambition, but with courage, clarity, and conviction. His death was not the end. It was the spark that lit centuries of philosophical inquiry, a reminder that the freedom to question is the cornerstone of any thoughtful society. And though he drank hemlock that day in Athens, his voice continues to echo wherever someone dares to ask, why? We hope this series inspired you to think more deeply, to listen more carefully, and to question more bravely. If this journey moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories that bring history's most profound moments to life. And remember, the examined life may not be easy, but it is always worth living. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep thinking.